And it's my pleasure to welcome you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sandra Brecker, and as CEO of the Robert Bosch Stiftung, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's virtual lunch talk of the Robert Bosch Academy, addressing the question whether and how we can achieve a food secure and climate neutral world. Governments are challenged to take more ambitious and immediate action to become climate neutral. And one key field of action to achieve net zero goals is the transformation of the food and agriculture system that faces the challenge of feeding 10 billion people around the world by 2050. There are fears and sometimes ideological debates about the right approach to this transformation. While some argue for organic agriculture to be the solution, others consider advanced plant breeding as necessary to guarantee food security for everyone. It's crucial that practitioners and policymakers from different sectors create a shared understanding amid complexity and strive for coherent action in order to prevent hunger and malnutrition, to protect biodiversity, and to counter climate change. It is a privilege to be able to discuss this question with two distinguished experts today. Professor Joachim von Braun is the director of the Center for Development Research at the University of Bonn. He is member of the German National Academy of Sciences, Leopoldina, vice president of Welthungerhilfe, and last but not least, he is a member of the board of trustees of the Robert Bosch Stiftung. Ertharin Cousin is Richard von Weizsäcker Fellow of the Robert Bosch Academy and Distinguished Fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. She was executive director of the United Nations World Food Programme and served as US ambassador to the UN agencies for food and agriculture in Rome. She has just spent several months in Berlin with us to engage with experts and decision makers on the topic, and will share some of the insights that she has gained on Germany in particular. And both of our speakers know each other quite well, and we look forward to their discussion. I will now hand over to you, Ertharin, and look forward to the conversation.
Well, Sandra, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. And thank you to you and the Academy for allowing me to spend the last several months here exploring these questions. When I began my research here at the Academy, I wanted to look at the issues of how did, or if it did, COVID impact the commitment of Germany and the Europeans to sustainability. And what I found, and what's been confirmed through a number of studies, is that in fact, there was no detrimental impact to government's commitments or private sector's commitments to sustainability as a result of COVID. If anything, there was a recognition of the need for climate change and supporting the reduction of greenhouse gases even more as a priority after COVID. But what I found challenging in my interviews that required me to pivot my questions was that the leadership, government, civil society leaders and even business were focused on the ecological issues related to climate change and the reduction of greenhouse gases as the tool for those ecological changes, but very little prioritization around the externalities, food security, health, and the opportunity for the economic opportunity that is impacted by climate. And so I began exploring those questions and where the blind spots are, where the opportunities are, and how to understand better how the government leaders, bureaucrats, as well as advocates on these issues are thinking about what is necessary. And as my fellowship ends, I have more questions than answers, but I'm hoping that in our conversation today, we can speak about both some of the answers that I've found, as well as the questions that I will continue to pursue even after I leave here. And I'm so excited today because I have the opportunity of sharing this conversation with a friend and mentor of mine in this space, and that's Professor Joachim von Braun. You can Google him and see his very long list of accomplishments and and professional achievements. But let me just say, Professor von Braun is a serious scholar and a fierce advocate for science-driven agricultural and food systems change. As a professor, he's been committed to not just teaching the next generation, but for shaping a holistic perspective of those he teaches, as well as those he advocates with, including myself, of the opportunity that science provides to us, but also the responsibility that we have for humanity with our increased global knowledge. That impression of Professor von Braun is reflected in his accomplishments, his honors, and the number of associations that he has, which, as I said, are too long and to articulate on a singular basis. But let me just say, his understanding of humanity and science, and the relationship between humanity and science, was recognized by Pope Francis when he reappointed him as the president of the Pontifical Academy of Science. So let's just jump right in. Professor von Braun, I've heard you speak about the divergence between the commitment to sustainability, greenhouse gas reductions, and achieving net zero, the net zero goals, and the adaptation challenges, addressing the adaptation challenges of the global south. If a just, sustainable transformation of the food system includes ecological as well as social and economic opportunity transition, what would it take for us to achieve a just transition of the food system?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Ertharin Cousin. Let me first thank you for inviting me, you and the Robert Bosch Foundation. Ertharin, we go back some time, and I have always admired your combination, your capacity to combine policy advice with science. You did that at the World Food Programme, major achievements, and in the Chicago Council. I hope when you finish your cooperation as a Weizsäcker Fellow, you can continue to connect the Robert Bosch Foundation think tank activities with the Chicago Council and other think tanks in the US. Coming to your question on a just system of climate policy. First of all, climate justice considers the poor at home and far away, because we are dealing with a global issue, and it has to consider future generations. So the poor and the future generations, those who are young today and those who are not yet born. Justice debate increasingly focuses on climate neglect as a criminal offense. I think we are headed towards a lot more attention to the legal aspects of injustice, not just philosophical or equity discussions, but the legal aspects of injustice, of indirect effects of those who pollute our atmosphere and impacting people far away from us. And I think that is a good trend. I only hope that the legal community gathers the evidence and the expertise to strengthen the processes towards a just climate transition system. Let me just point at the key policy tool, carbon pricing. Carbon pricing needs to be mainstreamed in all sectors of the economy. That is the efficiency requirement of carbon pricing at significant levels. But I hasten to say care needs to be applied in carbon pricing related to the food system. There we need to be selective with carbon taxation in support of healthy diets and in protecting low-income consumers' situation. Because hefty carbon pricing may lead to regressive effects hitting the poor more than the middle income and rich people. What we also need for action for a climate justice approach is innovative financing. The current financing for the climate policies is far too small. We need innovative approaches. Maybe we can come back to that later. But the food system must be included in climate policy because food and agriculture are both suffering from climate change and can be major contributors to get us out of the dilemma. Back to you, Ertharin.
So I really appreciate your recognition, as a lawyer, I should say, I appreciate your recognition of the role that the legal system is now playing. Because I must tell you, I was shocked when I arrived here in Germany and the Supreme Court handed down a decision finding the German government in breach of its duty of care to future generations, and quite clearly demanded that the government take action to reduce the levels of CO2. That decision was then followed by a Dutch court's decision that the Royal Dutch Shell was requiring Royal Dutch Shell to reduce its carbon emissions by a net 45% by 2030. And just as you noted, and others have suggested, the courts will play a significant role here. And indeed, that action by the court, I believe, stirred the Bundestag's action before they went out on holiday to pass legislation requiring net zero GHG emissions requiring net zero GHG by 2045, with significant action between now and 2030. As I said, coming from the U.S., this stunned me, because you would not see this kind of action in our Congress.
Yeah, but Ertharin, what do we see in the American orbit around climate policy at this stage? The beauty of having you here and having listened into and have been engaged in conversations with business leaders and political leaders in Germany, just as we are in the hot phase of election campaigns. What can you tell us about the American situation regarding climate policies? I'm picking up a mixed picture from aggressive, almost European policies in California and neglect in other areas. That's one issue which is on our mind. And secondly, what's your take on climate superpower policies, the US and China? If China isn't included, then we will get little out of the next COP. And that also relates to trade policy. Give us your reading on what we can expect from US climate policy coming weeks and years as we head to COP26.
Well, that's a lot. Let me say your reading of a mixed bag coming out of our government is quite accurate. But the Biden-Harris administration has been quite directed and proactive around issues related to climate as well as to the food system transformation. You will recall on the very first day of his administration, he rejoined the climate Paris Accord and named John Kerry as his special envoy. John Kerry, with his significant political capital, not just in the United States, but in the global community, I think it's quite an interesting and important choice, because it is, yes, what will the U.S. do domestically, but how will we use those relationships that we have developed over the long hegemonic position of the U.S. to deliver the global support, from the multilateral support that is necessary across governments for the change. And so you asked the right question, though. Well, how does China fit into this? Because we have witnessed since the start of the Biden-Harris administration the challenges in the communication between China and the United States. And we also recognize that U.S. and EU agreeing alone is not going to deliver the change that is required to support the goals that we all agree we must achieve. And so China must be part of that conversation. And I've heard Secretary Tony Blinken say that we will engage and work with China and cooperate with China where possible and confront where required. This is one of those spaces where we must identify the possibilities and work together to ensure the changes that are necessary. What's exciting to me is in the conversations that I've had in this role as a Weizsäcker Fellow, is that I've heard from friends in China that China is committed to both the agricultural sustainable agricultural transformation and making commitments that are necessary for that transformation, as well as following through on the greenhouse gas commitments, reduction commitments that they made at Paris. And so I think we're very much looking forward to hearing their comments at COP, but as well at the upcoming Food Systems Summit in September. That's going to be very directional. It's important to hear the direction that they'll set at that summit, because the U.S. is going to come into that summit, just as they do into the COP, with commitments both for their domestic investment as well as for their support for investment and adaptation in the developing world. And so if we can get everybody not just saying the right things about what each will do, but what they will do together, that is quite critical to the progress that we need.
Not much observed by or recognized by the media was a announced paradigm shift in China, which is nothing less radical, not less radical than the European Green Deal, when their Central Committee in April or May of this year announced a paradigm change towards gross ecosystems product accounting. So not GDP accounting, but gross ecosystems product accounting, including the value of ecological product changes. 19 indicators, and food and agriculture play a significant role in that accounting change. So I think there is a joint basis to work together in this big island of consensus, despite other conflicting issues. But back to you, Ertharin.
Yeah, I think you're spot on when you acknowledge the accounting changes that China announced in April of this year, because you will recall at the G7 the leaders agreed to new GAAP rules for measuring sustainability as part of the accounting of corporations, and that the announcement by China aligns quite well then with that announcement that was made at the G7. Those are the kinds of changes that we also need, because despite the concerns about some of the multi-sectoral nature of the UN Food Systems Summit, there's a recognition that governments alone cannot achieve the actions that are necessary. In China, whether we're talking about companies in China or those in the US and Europe, we must ensure that they are performing the actions that are necessary as well to reduce their carbon footprints, and that we are holding them measurably and accountably responsible for the actions that they're performing. And what has been interesting over the last several months is to see the action that is occurring in that space.
Yeah.
So, you know, you asked me about the U.S.'s commitments. One area that the U.S. has committed to is increased financing for agricultural innovation to support more sustainable agriculture. And the areas of innovation is one that we know is quite necessary. We cannot use the same old tools and expect different results. We need new tools. And some have argued that we don't necessarily need new tools, that what we need instead is more organic production, a change in diet and reduction in meat consumption, and reduction of waste. How do you see it?
I'm afraid we do need new tools, and we do need institutional innovations, especially the latter. Talking tools, I'm not just referring to technologies and crop innovation, etc. But the constraints we are facing relate to production, quality of diet, the sustainability of production. Let me give you a specific example. We know that there is a great opportunity for win-win to sequester more carbon in soils. But in order to do that, we need the new technologies to measure change in carbon in soils by remote sensing and by local handheld devices which are under development. So then agriculture, carbon farming becomes bankable. We need these technologies. We also need the technologies to make crop production more climate resilient. So the modern breeding technologies, the genomics-based CRISPR-Cas, etc., are needed, locally adapted, and the capacity building in developing countries and middle-income countries for that is very important. So that brings me to the support for implementation of what's currently being discussed in the Food Systems Summit, Ertharin. It's finance, it's science, it's sharing data, capacity building, and strengthening rights. It's those five. I repeat, finance. We cannot move forward with a few words and lip services in transforming the food system to make this climate resilient and serving the poor and nourishing all people. So finance, science, and knowledge, including indigenous knowledge, indigenous people's knowledge, data sharing, big data using, capacity strengthening, and rights.
Well, before I respond to your comment regarding the summit, let me remind our participants here today that we want them to join in this conversation. So I ask those of you who would like to ask a question or make a comment to either raise your hand or put your question into the chat box, and we will bring you into what I hope will be a robust conversation with everyone. When you talk about finance, I am very concerned that when we talk about innovation, too many of the changes that are coming online are coming online for the affluent, whether we're talking affluent farmers or affluent consumers from new food products that are coming online. And we need to ensure that we're providing the access to investment capitals, that capital that will not only create new innovations, but provide for equitable access to those innovative tools by the smallholder farmers with 500 million and poor and young farmers, women farmers, so that we can ensure more equitable access to a sustainable, nutritious, a sustainable food system that provides access to nutritious food. Because too often what we've seen in the past is new tools create even more disparity and dichotomies. And so that is central to the work that I will continue to do as I complete my fellowship here.
I'm less pessimistic. Ertharin, this is the first moment for a small disagreement, but I know you like it. Yes. I'm less pessimistic than you are there in seeing the inequality consequences of innovation and of technologies. Looking at the hotspots of digital innovation in Africa, say Senegal, Kenya, a lot of innovations in digital tools, reaching out through cell phones and smartphones in rural areas to farming men and women, are already in the testing and scaling phase, even more so in India. So speaking of digital innovations, I think we can beat the inequality effects. Where I agree with you is in the inequality consequences of macro effects of climate change and of CO2 pricing. Climate change, as we have it, is leading to more income loss among poor countries than richer countries so far. Research has shown that India's GDP would be 25% higher without climate change. The effect in Europe so far is not significant. So inequality between countries is increasing, and the poor typically are more hit by climate change. But I would not see that progressiveness of the distributional effects in digital technologies and biotechnologies.
Well, I appreciate that sentiment, and we will agree to disagree on this one, but I'm hoping you are right. Let's go to our participants. Hamid Hamirani was the first hand up. Hamid, over to you.
Hi, Ertharin. I'm Hamid Hamirani. I'm working with Ertharin. I'm the senior advisor at FSF. I have one comment and one question. The comment I have is that yes, we've talked about China for sure, but I think India is also an important element. If you look at it in last 9 years, just the diesel fuel in India represents 6% of the GDP. 9 years ago, it was only 3% of the GDP. While Europe, last year sort of committed to reducing, the carbon by 70 gigawatts, China has got more than 1,000 coal plants, and even now sort of planning to sort of produce more, 20 to 20. So I just wanted to know that I wanted to sort of create awareness that India is also a very important element and definitely needs to be looked at. In terms of my question, this is to Professor. We talk about carbon emission, but which Kyoto Principle and Paris Agreement says that we need to reduce carbon emission by 32 billion. 32 billion ton is today. They want to reduce it to 10 billion tons, so i.e. a reduction of 22 billion metric tons. Now, so far, if you just look at Bloomberg, if you look at the S&P 500 companies, they have announced carbon emissions. Some of it is greenwashing, I must admit, but about something like only 400 million, So there is a huge gap and an opportunity here. But my question, Professor, to you is that where are we in terms of validating and creating a system so that we can really see that it is not greenwashing and there are some tangible efforts being made and our rise in terms of reduction of carbon emissions? Over to you, Professor. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question, Hamid, and thank you for putting India into our minds. I just mentioned it. It's extremely important both for India's industries, industrial transformation. It has to become much more bio-based and much more renewable energy-based. The greenwashing issue is critical. Ertharin, I was in a discussion with Mr. Kerry, who visited the Vatican to discuss climate finance a couple of months ago. And he said that he admired the standard setting which the European Union has established. And I agree, this is the only large economic bloc which so far has established reasonably traceable standards for the industry standards for tracking green bonds and green investments, and thereby unleashing the forces of the capital markets to pour money into recarbonizing the biosphere and in saving forests, etc., and bringing industries down. So we need a global dialogue, at least between the US and China, but also the rest of the world, on these standards so that the international financial system can pour money into it. It cannot just be aid money.
Okay, I think you're spot on, but I also think that we have a lot of questions that we need to answer around those standards with measurements and monitoring systems that are in place. We don't have all the answers yet when we talk about the sequestration of carbon with agricultural production and regenerative farming practices. And so what we can allow is for our policies to get ahead of our science. And I can't believe I'm the one saying that to you.
Okay. No, I agree. RED Plus has so far not delivered at the scale, but where we have the big progress is in remote sensing, biomass change with low-flying satellites. Is a total new world on big data combining ground truthing with new satellite infrared monitoring.
So, and as many of you on this call know, I'm on the Bayer's supervisory board, and this is an area where they are in the process of implementing new tools to support our ability to perform in this area. Let's go to Carolina.
Yes, thank you so much for this excellent debate. It's excellent and intensive. I have been listening with great interest to what you have been saying, and I wanted to share particular arguments against that are raised in my part of the world, namely Eastern Europe, coming partly from our experience of communism and communist economy. Namely, very often there are fears expressed concerning the aims connected with the climate justice and also reducing the footprints of our human activities, the carbon footprints, and they are as follows. First, it is feared that fighting with the climate change would mean certain centralization of economy. And this is something which is considered to be very negative in this part of the world because of its history. The second is, of course, reducing or diminishing democracy. and taking some decisions, at least some decisions, over the heads of the citizens. The third is making impossible to countries that are less developed. They are developing to an extent that the best developed countries, for example, of the Western Europe, are where they are. So, just to name an example, some of the GDPs of the Central and Eastern European countries are only 1/3 of the German GDP of today. So those are three fears that are often expressed in the public spheres of Central and Eastern European countries. And I wanted to ask, what would you answer to them?
Joachim, do you want to start?
Happy to.
Please.
These are legitimate fears. In rich countries, the distributional effects, the democracy effects, the participatory undermining effects of policies tend to be neglected. So I think it's fair. And the global climate movement must certainly listen to these concerns. On your first fear, centralization, it's absolutely clear that multi-level governance needs to come into play, and not only central governance. Why? Because the whole opportunities around food and agriculture, which is 1/3 of, if you include the forest aspects, and the swampland aspects, 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions, that's local. If you don't have the local situation in mind of agroecology, you get nowhere, and that's why local government is so critical. Secondly, decline in democracy. Well, decentralized countries have the voice from the bottom. You know, that is in Europe very differently. There is a good news is that in the last 20 years, practically all countries of significance around the world have decentralized their government structures. Say India 30 years ago, for instance, putting the fourth layer in there with the panchayats. So the world has been decentralizing. And the less developing countries, a lack of voice, I fully agree. That we try in the science community to address by training at large scale lots of young scientists to be strong climate scientists, and thereby strengthen the advocacy capacity on a science basis in Asia, Africa, and Latin America.
So I will just add on to those very good comments by you, Joachim, in saying that in addition to multi-level governance, we also know we need multi-sectoral participation. That is the only way that we're going to achieve the outcomes that are so ambitious. I would also add, when we talk about the actors that are participating to ensure that we maintain democracies, we must also recognize indigenous communities in both the policy making and in the development of science that we invest in. Too often we focus on academic leaders and opinions as opposed to those of local actors, indigenous populations. I think to ensure democracy of outcomes as well as of new tools, that we include all of those parties into the solutions that we invest in, that we work to scale to address these issues. And that's Go ahead.
Let me jump in before you leave that point. One of the true surprises in the process of the ongoing process towards the Food Systems Summit was the amplified voice of substance, of knowledge base of the indigenous peoples. It was, for me, a pleasure to work with the indigenous peoples' knowledge communities and connect them to the scientific group, which I'm chairing for the summit. That is really new. These voices have been heard and will be heard, and science working with indigenous knowledge will not go away.
that is a significant outcome from the Food System Summit, because it completely changes the conversation and the potential for including that knowledge in the investment platform of solutions that we continue to pursue. Let me go to Usman, whose hand was next.
Thank you, Ertharin, and thank you, Joachim. It's a great discussion, and I very much like the format of this event, so it's taking place. So I think it's a very successful start to engage and exchange around these ideas. I think that climate change and the discussion we're having now is really us trying to find the peace treaty in the world between human and nature over the centuries. So on, we're doing a lot of damage to nature, but also we see that nature is fighting back. And we need to get to a place where we find a balance. Now, no way is that confrontation between people and planet, human and nature, struck as in Africa, because moving toward that treaty where we find some more balance between the two, the choices can be very complex and very difficult in an environment with communities who are feeling the brunt of climate change, the erosion of natural resource base, the change in environmental quality. All those are having real impact on people's livelihoods. We're not even talking about economic issues. But we also know that areas like agriculture and a lot of economic activities in these communities have a real impact on the same environment. However, those economic activities are also what they depend on their livelihood and their future. How do you strike a balance there? And I think a growing agricultural sector, accelerated growth, a broadening of the growth process will be important in resolving the issues of poverty and hunger and quality of life in the African countries in general. How do we get to doing that while minimizing the footprint, maintaining economic growth, to change the staggering levels of poverty and food insecurity and malnutrition? So this is going to be a very delicate balance. And what I wanted to hear from you and Joachim is, how do you see something like this shaping up in Africa to get to a place of not just win-win, but multiple win-wins, right? Like Schengen Fan was saying the other day, we have several fronts where you need progress, but not all of them can give it to you at once. So that delicate balance, and I appreciate Joachim a lot, the discussion we have had around the scientific group of the Food System Summit, the role of technology, the role of innovations, and the role of financing capacities. That's really where I think a lot needs to happen, but I would like to have your ideas around that. How do we resolve these multiple trade-offs to get to multiple win-wins? Thank you.
Joachim, over to you.
Happy to get started. Usman, thank you. This is very, very important what you bring up for the whole African continent. About 10 years ago, we had a research project interviewing at scale men and women farmers in Ethiopia and in East African countries, other East African countries. About 90% of men and women farmers said clearly yes to the question, have you noted climate change effects? That was 10 years ago already. They know. Why is that tragic? Well, women mostly emphasized when then follow-up question was asked, what are you doing and what would you like to do? Women emphasized planting trees, multiple purpose trees. Men emphasized irrigation, but they agreed basically on a portfolio. It wasn't that different. The investment for that is not forthcoming in order to make African smallholders de-risk. That the de-risking investments costs money. It's not just insurance, but it is these things which I anecdotally addressed. So nature positive production in Africa requires inputs, requires fertilizer at appropriate ways, requires smart agroecological approaches which nurture soils which often are not so good. So the whole investment agenda within Africa needs to change. We in the scientific group have argued that African countries need to spend at least 1% of their food system related GDP on science and innovation. And the least developed countries need to be helped over that hurdle in order to have a meaningful science policy that delivers resilience, climate resilience. And we need to increase development aid, and we need to increase innovative financing. We need food and anti-hunger bonds, mobilizing. Those are the key propositions for the summit from our group. Usman knows that, but I'm pontificating it here in the group. Over to you.
Thank you for those comments, and Usman, thank you for those very insightful and thoughtful questions. The reality is, and you know these answers better than I do because some of it you've taught me over the years, and that is, yes, we need more intensification of production on less land. We know the difference. We all know the numbers of the difference in the production on a hectare in Africa versus the production of a hectare in Europe or the US. And so we recognize that we need the investment that Joachim just talked about to increase that production, and to increase that production, leapfrogging the challenges of agriculture that we've seen since in the U.S. and Europe since World War II, to bringing those new tools that will help us increase production without I'll simply say to sustainably increase production, to ensure that we're protecting the soils and not detrimentally impacting groundwaters, et cetera. And so that is critical. But what I would say that is also critical, because we spent so much time in the past 20 years looking at what happens before the farm gate and not after the farm gate. And it is so critical that we also invest in the logistics and the systems that are necessary to support the market developments that will ensure that farmers are not only increasing their productions, but they're increasing their incomes, and we're making food more available to the markets, both in the rural areas as well as in growing urban areas. And the challenge is that we saw the problems in that logistics system as a result of COVID, when we saw a breakdown in the transport and storage of products between the rural areas and the urban areas, and as a result of COVID and the COVID restrictions. And so it highlighted what is necessary to improve the opportunity for the trade, not only locally but regionally, which is critical to not just creating more sustainability in the system, but to addressing those challenges of access to more nutritious food for the entire population, and addressing those challenges of hunger and malnutrition. The issues that we must overcome is one that Joachim stated, but I will underscore. The developed world must live up to its commitments for adaptation, and not just adaptation for the adaptation investments in sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the developing world. And those adaptation dollars must not only include transportation and energy, but they must include investment in agriculture. And that is the message that we must carry into COP26, and look for the answers that will support support the work that needs to occur on the ground. With that, let me go to Catherine.
Wonderful. Thank you both very much. Really exciting discussion, and I wanted to ask a slightly different question potentially. So, you know, within Europe, myself and a few others have been thinking about the concepts of using digital technologies for food hubs. So, how do we help food hubs compete with sort of the large scale systems that are there in Europe, which are, you know, massive supply chains basically. And the idea being that you'd use small scale farmers, help them create economies of scale so that they are, you know, their organic practices and their more just practices are embedded into the food system. Separate to that, however, I've noticed, you know, recently over the last 2 years, we've sort of noticed a change in the way that food hubs are speaking. And that's the question I'd really like to ask both of you. More and more of them are sort of saying one of the reasons that we really need to do this is we no longer trust the state to be able to ensure food security for us as climate change gets worse and worse and worse. So I wanted to really ask about what do you think the role of the state is in the creation of these kind of systems? And do you think there is a role for these smaller scale solutions, you know, as part of a much bigger sort of policy around food security and climate change?
Mm-hmm. I'll start this time, Joachim, and just say that food hubs proved to be a very necessary solution to addressing failed food systems during the COVID response. And many of us in this space saw the value of work that had been happening quite quietly prior to COVID, but to recognize that direct relationships, direct trade between farms and consumers as a significant opportunity for increasing access to nutritious food. We also identified some challenges, and that one of those is affordability. And I won't spend a lot of time on that, but I think that's a question that we need to address with how do we make direct the food hubs more, and the provision of food through food hubs more affordable for a broader population. So as a solution, I see them as one in a diverse basket of solutions that we will need to support a more sustainable food system that provides access to more nutritious foods through a diversity of tools, but ensuring that that food is available for everyone. And that is why it is quite important that we continue to strengthen the existing food value chains to ensure that and there's a role for government and continue to do that, in both with food hubs and with traditional in food safety and transport regulations and inspection regulations, etc. But we need both of them, and we need to strengthen all of these tools for providing access to nutritious food. Anything else?
Let me just add a footnote to your very disturbing observation of loss and trust in the state that you, Catherine, mentioned. I'm afraid you're right, but that we observe a reduction in the trust in government and in the state. But state is in a double dilemma there. There's loss in trust because some feel state is doing too much, and others lose trust because the state is doing too little. We see that in the current election campaigns for the German federal government, and we see it in particular among young people. So climate is the hotspot in that trust debate, and it needs to be gained. I feel it's very important that civil society, faith-based organizations, business, need to not do their own thing in that context, but be supportive of sound governance for the economic system transformation which we need for a sustainable economy that deals with the climate agenda. But the trust issue is fundamental.
Thank you for the question, and thank you for your response, Joachim. Laurette, Professor Dubé.
Yes, thank you for a very rich discussion. I'm Laurette Dubé from McGill, the founding chair and scientific director of the McGill Center for the Convergence of Health and Economics. And over the last 15 years, we have been really taking food as the domain to say, can we tweak a bit our model of industrial development? And one key facet of where we are at this point in time, which make us optimistic that we can have a world reset on more convergence between the developed and the developing world, more convergence between the social, the commercial, and the public, is potentially the ability of the digital transformation of science and society. In complex systems, we always say that information is key to transformation. So the two questions that I have, or 2 points on which I would love to have your commentary, Ertharin and Joachim, is to what extent the whole, or to what extent there can be more synergy between government, private sector, and civil society in investing in a digital architecture embedded into real-world solution that will provide the transparency, the effectiveness, and also the ability to connect without centralizing in some way. So can there be an architecture that is complementary to road, to buildings, and so on, that is there? That's my first question. And then the second question, I still believe that we are, quote unquote, developing the developing world with the model of the first industrial revolution, which was that agriculture is just the entry point to industrial development. Whereas I think that when the question was posed earlier, how to have a vibrant agricultural growth, I think that it is extremely important to do so, but to do so at the same time as we are creating a vibrant society in all the sector and more of the continuity between the rural and urban. And for that, it will need that science that is considered is not just the basic life and biological science. There is the science of economy, of society, of complexity. So your two thoughts on transforming the whole of everyone in building this kind of digital architecture to support connection, transparency, and accountability. And second, what science should be brought into the this discussion beyond what the science that is already there. And I am done. Thank you.
And Joachim, this is really in your wheelhouse, so over to you, my friend.
Okay. Let me be, I'm afraid we have to be brief at this stage if I understand our schedule. A clear yes to your first question. Digital platforms are the name of the game. They are springing up in Africa. Multi-purpose service platforms combining education, extension, market access, and the right information for food, and embracing also food. We are no longer on your second in the first industrial revolution and reinventing it. We are in the fourth, number 4. Digitization is merging with the bioscience and changing the whole innovation agenda. What we need to make sure is that these processes are transparent, that they are decentralized, that access barriers are not high, and that requires regulation. and smart regulation. But for low-income countries and middle-income countries, the basics are often still missing, and that is electrification. So the electrification infrastructure needs a boost. And well, we are sitting in Germany, and I know plenty of hotspots where your cell phone rarely works. So that is discriminating rural areas. Back to you, Ertharin.
That's terrific. With an eye on the clock, I'm going to let that answer stand and move on to our next question. Natalie.
Thank you for a very, very interesting discussion. My question is really a layman's question. And perhaps it's triggered by the comment that was made by Joachim earlier, saying that the media, I work in the media, have missed a major paradigm change in China, which is the shift from GDP to GEP, gross ecosystem product. And I'd love you to elaborate on that. How could you? I know we have little time, but could you explain why this is as important, perhaps, as you suggested, as the EU Green Deal, as radical, you said, and how both of you see this leading to any kind of progress? And I have another related question, which I'm sure we won't get into, but if on these big global issues and to do with science and also trust in government, how can we trust China on which is, with the system it has, the political system it has, the digital totalitarianism it has? How can we trust China to be a partner in these big issues, despite this interesting paradigm change? Thank you.
Do you want me to take the first?
You take the first and I'll take the second.
You take the second. This is not just an article in some government newspaper in China, but it is a statement from the Central Committee. It's a Central Committee document, and that matters in that nation. Describing the approach of gross ecosystems product, including the value of ecological products and services, and accounting for nature, the value of nature change with 19 indicators, and attributing that to agricultural production, climate, air quality, water, and tourism. The hotspot Shenzhen has started to implement it, and so did others. Yes, I would say let's wait and see, but let's see. This is an approach which the economics profession has advocated about 15, 20 years ago to value total economic value, TEV, total economic value, which we apply to valuation of soil and land use and ecosystems. And we have advocated to apply that to the whole food system. The food system, let me close by those numbers. In the market, we spend 9 trillion, in German we call it billion, 9 trillion per annum on food. But the indirect costs for the environment are another 8 trillion, and the health costs for obesity, hunger, etc., and air pollution are another 11 trillion. So we are totally mispricing and miscosting food in the food system. So we need to change our accounting system to true cost accounting, to total economic value. And this is no academic debate anymore, not in Europe and not in China. I wonder about the US.
I'm going to leave that question in the air because of the amount of time that we have, and just go directly to the question that was asked by Natalie, and say that when we have as a global community of actors working together to solve significant problems, we've found ourselves in this situation before, where the answer that was given by many in the past has been trust but could verify, recognizing that it is about the accountability mechanisms that we put into place to ensure that the commitments that any country is making, including China, are actually performed. And the sad but real news is that we will know if they're actually living up to those commitments and achieving those goals, because the science does not lie. We will continue to have the IPCC reports. We will continue to have global measurements of emissions, and we will, and the data will tell us whether they are meeting the commitments that they make, both to their own population as well as to the global community. I appreciate that we have about 4 more hands up. I was given permission to go about 10 or 15 minutes over, and if the audience wants to stay with us, we will go and continue to come to you for questions. So let's go to Wanjira.
Thank you very much. Really exciting discussion. There's a growing rift. I want to ask this question. There's a growing rift in the food systems transformation ecosystem discussion that seems to be very unhelpful. And on the one hand, there's a very large group, and it's playing out quite unhelpfully in the Food System Summit now as we lead up to that. On the one hand, there are those who feel that to protect the prominent role of smallholder farmers and the role that they play in food production in especially non-industrialized economies is crucial. So they want to see agroecological principles secured and all the principles that we've actually heard articulated here, the need for, that there is no need for inputs to increase productivity, that we can actually accelerate and increase productivity with, the assumption that agroecology means non-technical is also flawed, that we can actually increase productivity with agroecological principles. We must accelerate local market creation, etc. And then we have, on the other hand, a model that says to increase productivity, to the level we need is absolutely impossible without inputs, especially at least microdosing, and that our soils are too depleted to even produce what we need without micronutrients like phosphorus, for example. And the whole idea that my grandmother's seed could be saved and produce food in this current soils is flawed. Which is it? And I feel for Africa at least. My name is Wanjira Mathai. I should have introduced myself. I'm the Regional Director for the World Resources Institute's Africa programs. And I find this discussion extremely unhelpful because clearly there must be some direction in this discussion, but it has torn apart the food systems, ecosystem friends. So I just wanted to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Joachim, why don't you start?
Yeah, this is a very helpful comment on a very unhelpful debate. I much appreciate, Wanjira, what you're saying. We have been put to task as the scientific group for the UN Food System Summit, appointed by UN leadership, precisely because of this undercurrent in the current exchange of views over what is the need and the appropriate pathways forward for a sustainable and people-serving and planet-serving food system. And we have been open to that debate, but I point you to the outputs of the scientific group, underlining the need for having a locally adapted, innovative system. I underline the food systems transformation require a heavy dose, in this case, not a microdose. I know you referred to microdosing fertilizers, which is a wonderful technology. A heavy dose of innovation investments in order to transform smallholder farming, all farming actually. And I believe this whole debate can only be overcome by a science evidence-based positioning. We have published on Monday an article in Nature which outlines the 7 priorities, which the time does not permit me to highlight, the technological aspects of nature-positive production, which is not no input or low input, but it is especially high in knowledge input, in science input, and in appropriate investment in for seed innovation, plant breeding, fertilizer, plant protection, mechanization, the opportunities there, and value chain connection. Sorry that I'm so much in a rush. We emphasize also that the whole value chains, the system needs to be emphasized there so that the food waste and losses are overcome by technology and behavior change.
Very quickly, I just add on to say that you're absolutely right. This has been a challenging and very unhelpful debate, and we need to overcome at the global level the romanticizing the notion of smallholder farmers and poverty, and have the opportunity to create the kinds of locally based solutions that provide for addressing the ability of all 500 million of those smallholder farmers to ensure that they can produce at the highest quality in the most sustainable way possible, using the diversity of innovative as well as indigenous tools that support the achievement of that goal. And I'll stop there because we could spend the next hour talking about this issue, and thank you very much for that question. Matthias, I'm going to apologize to all of our remaining hands that are up, and starting with you, Matthias, because I'm mindful of the clock and that I was given very strict instructions that we needed to wrap up at 1:45, and so I want to ask one final question, and I'll give one final response, and then we will give you back your day. And I want to thank you all and let you all know that both I and Joachim are available for any questions that you have offline at any time regarding these issues. Both of us share this passion, as you can see, for these issues, and would appreciate continuing this dialogue with any of you bilaterally. Joachim, before we close, you have a senior role in the UN Food System Summit. What will create a successful summit in your mind that will help us achieve many of the issues that we've been talking about here today?
Well, let me also join in apologizing to the colleagues on the call, and please send us a mail. I'm sure Robert Bosch Foundation can facilitate that. A successful summit will create the initiative in 4 areas to nourish all people, boost nature-based production, advance equitable livelihoods, and build resilience. And that's the climate agenda, the 4th point. A successful summit will have prepared innovations in institutions that follow up. The summit will be successful if the follow-up process is successful. And that is successful if it is not just going in circles and going back to business as usual, but if it mobilizes the finance, if it mobilizes the people as it has before, the past 12 months with the 140 national dialogues and the more than 700 specialized dialogues around the world talks food currently in a way it never has before. The world has to act, so I expect the Secretary General to beef up the current draft statement, which is not powerful enough in my opinion yet, calling for bringing money to the table, innovation to the table, and creating new institutions. Maybe an IPCC food type organization with the existing a network with the existing Rome-based agencies could serve that purpose. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'll simply add on to that very good summary that I agree with everything. We've only disagreed on one time in this entire conversation. Impressive. But to simply say that the summit will be successful if it performs all of the actions that you outlined, Joachim, but also catalyzes a understanding outside our community of interest, outside of all of us who talk about this on a regular basis, of the work that is necessary for us to ensure that we create a sustainable agriculture system that supports both our environment, our health, our food security, as well as creates economic opportunity for all of the actors across the food system. That's what will be, I think, necessary for us to achieve these audacious goals. This has been a delightful conversation. I thank you all for joining us and for staying with us as we went over time and participating with your very thoughtful, provocative questions. And Joachim, again, thank you for participating. Thank you to the Bosch Academy and Foundation for this opportunity to be with you here today and for the supporting me through these works over the last months. With that, goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.